My mom tried to buy my forgiveness after my brother got my fiancée pregnant before our wedding, but I took the money and let karma take care of the rest. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman. I'll call her Lila. At the time, I truly believed she was the person I would marry. Lila and I had been together for nearly 5 years, and our relationship seemed solid. We were both lawyers, which meant we lived demanding and fast-paced lives, but we always made sure to prioritize each other whenever we had free time. The year I proposed to Lila was supposed to be the happiest year of our lives, but that same year, something unexpected happened. She lost her job. The loss came after it was discovered that she had violated some company rules. I won't go into specific details because it's personal, but I will say the company fired her in a pretty unceremonious manner after what she did. If you've ever known a workaholic perfectionist, you might understand how a loss like this can crush them to their core. Work wasn't just a job for Lila. It was part of her identity, her pride, and her purpose. Losing it so abruptly left her reeling. Lila immediately threw herself into job hunting, applying to countless firms and corporations. Unfortunately, her experience was very specialized, and opportunities weren't exactly easy to come by, especially given the circumstances of her dismissal. Months passed, and she still hadn't secured a new position. Throughout it all, I tried to be as supportive as possible. I reassured her that she didn't need to worry about finances. We were engaged after all, and I saw it as my responsibility to take care of her during this difficult phase. Knowing Lila had a tendency to obsess over things and stress herself out, I encouraged her to relax and not let the situation consume her. To my relief, she took my advice, or at least, she tried. With her newfound free time, she decided to pursue something that had always been a dream of hers, learning landscaping. She enrolled in a local landscaping class and began dedicating her free hours to this new hobby. Incidentally, it was the same landscaping class my brother, Mason, was attending. Let me tell you a bit about Mason. He's the complete opposite of me. While I was the responsible one growing up, focused on my studies and career, Mason was the carefree one. He spent his school days getting into mischief, earning a reputation as a womanizer. That reputation followed him through college and beyond. Mason was the type who never stayed with a girl for long and rarely took anything seriously. Lila had met Mason early in our relationship and knew exactly what kind of person he was. So when she started attending the same landscaping class as Mason, I thought their paths crossing there was just a coincidence. But looking back, it was when things began to change. Over the course of a few weeks, the two of them became surprisingly close. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mason occasionally offered to pick her up and drop her off at class, which seemed considerate, though unusual. Lila would come home excited, telling me stories about what she and Mason had done in the landscaping class or showing me pictures of the things they had worked on. But then, their interactions extended beyond landscaping. They started hanging out on weekends, doing things like visiting art museums or trying new restaurants. These were activities Lila and I normally enjoyed together, but now she was doing them with Mason instead. Over time, there were many more changes in Lila's behavior. She was spending far more time with Mason than I was comfortable with, and it was starting to affect our relationship. She even began canceling our date nights to go out with him. I'm not the type to stay silent and let things fester, so one night, I confronted her directly. I asked her bluntly if there was anything going on between her and Mason. Lila was shocked by my question. She even seemed offended. She vehemently denied that anything inappropriate was happening and insisted that her time with Mason was purely platonic. She explained that spending time with him was fun and lighthearted, comparing it to hanging out with a younger brother. She seemed genuinely hurt that I would even suggest otherwise. And for a moment, I felt guilty for doubting her. But deep down, her explanations didn't fully put me at ease. Things came to a head just 2 months before our wedding. At the time, I was working tirelessly with a heavy workload to ensure everything was financially in order. Since Lila had lost her job, I had taken on full financial responsibility for our home and all the wedding expenses. She still hadn't found a new job, and while she used some of her savings for her personal needs or emergencies, I was carrying most of the burden. Between paying for everything and the stress of planning a wedding, my hours at the office had become longer and more exhausting. I wasn't as present as I should have been. And looking back, maybe that gave Lila and Mason the opportunity to get as close as they did. One night, I came home early from a business trip. I was eager to surprise Lila and spend some time with her. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed my brother's car parked outside. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Mason had a habit of showing up unannounced, but this time was different. It was past 9 p.m., and seeing his car there that late raised a red flag. The living room was empty, but the TV was on. My eyes immediately landed on beer cans scattered on the floor. And then on something unmistakable, Lila's underwear carelessly tossed among them. I knew in that instant what I was about to find. A part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, But another part, the one that needed irrefutable proof, pushed me to go on. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I walked slowly and stopped at the bedroom door. There they were, Lila and Mason, entangled in the most intimate way imaginable. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't even notice I was standing there. Usually, I'm a calm and composed person, but this was betrayal of the highest order. Without saying a word, I entered the room, walked up to the bed, and grabbed Mason by the back of the neck. I yanked his face away from Lila, and the shock on his face was almost satisfying. He turned to look at me, and his expression instantly shifted from confusion to terror. I didn't even look at Lila. Mason immediately started stammering, apologizing to me, but his words meant nothing to me in that moment. I punched him square in the nose. The crunch of bone brought me a grim satisfaction as blood began to pour from his face. He screamed in pain, but I wasn't done. I hit him again and again. Each punch landed harder than the last. Blood dripped from his nose and stained his shirt, but I didn't care. He stumbled back, his hands feebly trying to block me, but I kept going. When Mason was on the floor bloody and begging me to stop, I turned my attention to Lila. She was sitting on the bed, trembling and sobbing. I looked her straight in the eyes and told her she had 10 minutes to get out of my house. If she didn't, I warned her I wouldn't hesitate to leave her in the same bloody state as my brother. She started begging me, apologizing over and over. She said she could explain and beg me not to kick her out, that I should give her a chance to fix things, but I wasn't interested in her excuses or apologies. I glanced at my watch and said coldly, "You have 9 minutes." The tone of my voice and the look in my eyes must have told her I wasn't joking because she hurried to get out of bed and started dressing with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began packing what she could. When she finished, dragging her half-filled suitcase down the stairs, she turned to me one last time. Her voice was broken as she begged me to listen to her, claiming she loved me and deserved a chance to explain herself. Without saying a word, I took her hand, slid the engagement ring off her finger, and pushed her toward the door. She tried to resist pleading with me to reconsider, but I'd had enough. I opened the door and shoved her out into the night. She stumbled onto the porch, still crying and screaming for forgiveness. I didn't even look back as I slammed the door in her face. Mason's face was still bloodied from our fight, and while I was still boiling with rage, I didn't want to be responsible for anything worse happening to him. I called my parents and told them everything that had happened. My dad was furious with Mason, and my mom was in shock, but they both said they would come over immediately. When they arrived, my mom, being a nurse, took care of Mason's injuries. She cleaned and bandaged his wounds, which were thankfully mostly superficial. Meanwhile, my dad took me to the backyard away from Mason. He could see my hand still trembling with anger and that I was barely holding it together. A little later, Mason came out to the backyard with my mom. His face was bruised, his nose bandaged, and there were still traces of blood on his shirt. He apologized for betraying me, claiming he never intended for things to happen the way they did, but then he dropped the bomb. He said he was in love with Lila. I finally turned to look at him, furious. He continued explaining how he believed Lila felt the same way about him. He assured me that this had been the first time they had slept together, as if that somehow made things better. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me their messages, conversations filled with flirty texts, secrets, and Lila's confessions about how unhappy she was in our relationship. According to Mason, she was the one who had invited him to stay over that night, thinking I was still on my business trip. As I read those messages, my rage began boiling over again. Mason kept talking, telling me he regretted betraying me but also insisting he had never felt this way about anyone before. He said he couldn't stop himself and begged me for forgiveness. My dad, who had been listening silently, finally had enough. He told Mason he was lucky if he didn't do the same thing to him that I had done earlier. But my mom's reaction was different. Mason had always been her favorite, and I could see how she was struggling with the situation. My mom started saying that regardless of what I decided to do about Lila, I needed to forgive my brother. She said he seemed genuinely remorseful and that two brothers shouldn't be at odds over a woman. She even offered me money to cover the wedding expenses. But when I told her I was willing to accept her check but not reconcile, she withdrew her offer. I cut her off and told my parents I wasn't in the mood for sermons or advice. The only thing I wanted at that moment was for them to take Mason and leave. I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. My dad nodded, understanding that I needed space, and helped Mason into the car. My mom hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and mediate, but eventually, she followed them. In the weeks that followed, I was still dealing with the aftermath. Lila had been persistently texting me, begging for forgiveness and trying to explain herself, but her explanations always revolved around the same tired excuses that were pretty similar to what Mason had already told me. She claimed that she and Mason never intended to hurt me. Essentially, I ignored the messages all week. Then, out of nowhere, I got a phone call from Mason. He informed me that he and Lila had just found out she was pregnant and that the baby was his. He said that since she was expecting his child, he wanted to marry her and wanted my blessing, which I didn't give. My mother's reaction only made everything worse. She had already been trying to act as a mediator between Mason and me, but now she seemed to view Lila's pregnancy as some kind of divine intervention. She told me it was God's plan for Lila to get pregnant this way, and that maybe Mason and Lila were always meant to be together. It was as if she was trying to justify the unimaginable, to excuse what they had done because of the pregnancy. That was when I told my mother I knew exactly what she was doing, and that if she decided to side with Mason and Lila, our relationship would be over. I wasn't joking. My brother's betrayal was enough, but having my own mother defend them was something I couldn't accept. My father tried to stay neutral, perhaps thinking it would help de-escalate the tension. Regardless, my mother offered Lila financial support, assuring her that she and the baby would be well taken care of. But, of course, there was a condition. My mother insisted that she and Mason had to get married. After all, that was what Mason wanted too. My mom was relentless in her pursuit of this outcome, refusing to even consider the idea of her grandchild being born out of wedlock. When I found out that Mason and Lila were actually going to get married and had started sending out wedding invitations to our relatives, I felt furious and humiliated. Without further discussion, I simply kept my word and cut my mother and brother out of my life. However, my mother doesn't give up easily. For weeks after the fallout, she called me non-stop, left voicemails, and even showed up at my door uninvited, trying to guilt me into reconciling. It was suffocating. That's when I knew the only way to escape her was to leave town entirely. It's been 3 years since they destroyed my life, and I moved to a new city, cutting ties with almost everyone in my family except my father. He respected my decision to move away and understood why I needed the distance, even though it saddened him that I no longer visited. In these 3 years, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I didn't share my new number with anyone except my dad. I made new friends, found a sense of normalcy again, and worked hard to leave the past behind. So imagine my surprise when yesterday, I found Lila at my door, ringing the bell. When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her at first. Lila looked nothing like the woman I once loved. She looked as if she was sick, or had suffered a lot during this time. She was there holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. The child had Mason's sharp features, leaving no doubt he was the father. I wondered, why was she here? How did she find me? What did she want? Finally, I broke the silence. Lila, what are you doing here? She was crying as she begged to come inside, saying she had something important to discuss with me. My first instinct was to say no and send them back, but then I looked at the little girl beside her, staring at me with those innocent wide eyes. I couldn't be rude in front of the child, so I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. I showed them the couch and offered them water. Once they settled, I sat across from them and asked, "What are you doing here?" I already knew she wouldn't have found me on her own. I hadn't given my address to anyone except my dad, and I trusted that he'd keep it secret unless something truly important came up. So what was so important that he'd give her my location? Instead of answering right away, Lila reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to me without saying a word. I opened it and immediately recognized my mother's handwriting. My mom had written, bluntly, that it was my responsibility to fix the mess Mason had created. She explained how Lila and Jesse were struggling, how Mason had abandoned them, and how as Mason's brother and Jesse's uncle, I needed to help them because Lila was the woman who was almost my wife, and the child was my niece. I looked at Lila, confused and angry. What's this supposed to mean? I asked her. That's when Lila broke down and started telling me the whole story. According to her, Mason had been unfaithful in their marriage from the very beginning. Even after Lila gave birth to their daughter Jessie, my brother continued to have affairs intermittently throughout their time together. For her part, Lila had tried to make things work, hoping they'd improve over time even if just for Jessie's sake. But 3 months ago, Mason abruptly packed his things and left. No explanations, no note, no warning. He simply vanished. Since then, Lila had been on her own. She had no job, no savings, no home. She and Mason had been living in a rented house, and without him, she couldn't afford to stay. My mom, feeling some sense of obligation because of Jessie, had been giving Lila money to support them. But now, with Mason practically gone for good, my mom had decided she no longer wanted to be responsible for Lila and her child. Lila went on to tell me that my mother wanted me to take care of her and Jessie because they had nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to. I felt completely disgusted by what she was asking and how ridiculous it was that both she and my mother expected me to help. Not only had my mother sided with Mason during the initial betrayal, but now she was trying to push the consequences of his actions onto me. My mom's relentless favoritism toward Mason was back on full display. I told Lila immediately, quite bluntly and in front of her child, that she had no right to expect any help from me. This was not my child. She was no longer my fiancée, and clearly, this wasn't my responsibility. Though I felt bad that Mason had just abandoned her, she should have seen it coming. After all, he wasn't the most trustworthy or responsible person. I wasn't going to let myself be manipulated into helping. So I asked Lila to leave. She started crying, saying she had nowhere to go, no money, and that what little she had left she'd spent on gas to come find me. I ended up giving her enough to fill her tank before asking her to leave. So, that's my story about my mom and her favoritism. I recently discovered this subreddit about parents who favor one child, and it seemed like a fitting place to share my story. Update 1. I want to clarify a few things. My mom's behavior in this situation also completely baffles me. The fact that she's trying to guilt me into helping Lila and her child after everything that's happened seems incredibly selfish to me. I understand she might feel obligated because of her granddaughter, but she shouldn't expect me to clean up the mess her golden child left behind, especially after how things turned out when I was the one betrayed. If my mom wants to have a favorite child, then she can have him, but she should also take care of him. I agree with some of your comments that my dad betrayed me too. Instead of offering me the support I needed after everything that happened, he chose to stay neutral. While he scolded my brother that one time, he never truly took my side. By not challenging my mom's manipulative behavior, he also played a role in this betrayal. I plan to have a conversation with him soon. Yes. Mason left Lila, but that doesn't automatically make it my responsibility to take care of her. She made her choices, and while I can feel some sympathy for her given the circumstances, I don't owe her anything. The fact that she showed up at my door with nothing but a sob story and a child only highlights her desperation. I didn't turn her away out of spite. I simply made it clear that it's not my job to fix what Mason broke. I'm not obligated to take care of her just because she's in a tough spot now. No, that child is definitely not mine. Lila and I broke up weeks before she got pregnant, and by the time we ended things, it had been a while since we'd been intimate. The timeline is clear, and there's absolutely no chance I'm the father. There's no need for a test or anything. Besides, Jessie has all of Mason's features: his face, his eyes, his smile. It's like looking at him as a child. I have no doubts Mason is her father. I don't need a paternity test because the resemblance is undeniable. The child is, without a doubt, Mason's daughter, and I won't let myself be dragged into any more confusion. No, I don't want to adopt my niece. I can't believe some of you are even suggesting this. Regardless of Lila's financial or emotional situation, she's the mother, and it's her responsibility. I don't understand why she never worked after getting married or why she didn't save money. Mason is the father, so even if they're separated, both Lila and Mason should take responsibility for their child. Mason has no choice but to pay child support. Update 2. I spoke with my parents about everything. I already knew my dad had given Lila my address, but I wanted to hear it directly from him. I called him and bluntly asked why he agreed to share my location with her after I had repeatedly asked him not to and what he expected me to do for Lila and her daughter after all these years. My dad went silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. Then he sighed deeply and apologized. "I'm sorry, son. I really am," he said. "We did everything we could to help Lila, but with Mason gone for so long, we could only do so much. Your mom begged me to give her your address. She said, maybe, if you saw her after all this time, you might want to help her somehow. Since she has nowhere else to go, I felt my frustration grow and asked, why would you think I'd want to help someone like her? She betrayed me with Mason. She hurt me. And now you want me to help her?" My dad said he understood why I was angry. He explained that neither he nor my mom wanted things to end this way, but that Lila and Jessie were family now, at least to them. He believed I was her only option. He apologized again, but I didn't listen. I told him we were done. I had trusted him to be different from my mom, but it turned out they were all the same, backstabbing traitors. Did they really think I'd somehow forget the past, accept Lila and my brother's child into my life, and start taking care of them? Wow. It's a hard blow to realize my parents truly didn't care about me. I told my dad firmly and without hesitation to lose my number and forget I ever existed to him. Since he knew my address, I warned him that if he or my mom showed up at my house, I'd call the police. My dad tried to apologize again, begging me to listen, but I wasn't interested anymore. "Don't call me again," I said. "Just don't. You made your choices, and I'm making mine." If he hoped I'd let him say one last thing, I'm sorry for him. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number. What my dad did is unforgivable, and there's no turning back. Update 3. It's been almost a month since my last update. I finally managed to locate Mason with the help of one of my friends. Turns out, Lila was right. Mason has been living with his latest fling in a nearby town, pretending he has no responsibilities as if he doesn't have a family. I'm not surprised. That's who he's always been. I can't believe this is the same guy who told